So here again, as Karin has mentioned, the project is called Do Me Equal. It's about to finish. Will finish next month, and it has involved research on domestic workers and domestic workers' conditions and social movements in 9 countries in the world: India, the Philippines, Taiwan, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, Spain, Italy, and Germany. The picture you see is actually from Taipei when we went there for our fieldwork trip. Giulia Garofalo and we took part in a demonstration, and these are the pictures from that moment. Let me go on. So the project builds on, we can say that the project builds on the awareness that domestic workers globally, and in particular in the 9 countries considered, still experience high levels of exploitation, discrimination, and exclusion from labor rights and legal protections compared to other workers. We also know that they suffer from social stigmatization due to representation of domestic work as a demeaning and dirty activity. We know that their work is not recognized as work in society for the association with women's caring dispositions. Moreover, we also know that domestic work is largely performed, and this was a really important part of our research, the fact that it is performed in these countries and most generally by women and by people who belong to the most vulnerable social groups in each context, such as internal or international migrants, depending on the country, ethnic minorities, racialized women. For the case of India, we can speak about low caste or people from so-called tribal groups, or in general, poorly educated and impoverished women. Yet, on the good side, we also know that domestic work has become, in recent years, an object of governance, or we could say global governance. It has become an object of conflict and negotiations, which have involved several actors. So we can say that despite being traditionally seen, as we know, as unorganizable, domestic workers have instead been increasingly engaged in collective organizing via unions and other forms of mutual aid groups. They've succeeded in gaining visibility and attention of various international actors. This phenomenon, this increasing attention, of course, accelerated in the years on which our project, the results I will speak of today actually, will focus on, which is the 10 years period 2008-2018, a period that we call as the one of C189 process. And it starts with 2008, which is the moment when the ILO put again, importantly, on its agenda, the question of domestic work. It culminates, of course, in 2011 with the promulgation of the Convention 189 and the Recommendation 201. And it ends in 2018, which is the time of our fieldwork, so 2008-2018. So here in this slide, you see all the some of the women, but all the names of the women that have made possible this project. I don't have the time to mention all the names and all the functions. You can see some of the names, all the names here written. Of course, for me, this is an opportunity to thank them all once again. I think that in their different positions, they've all given a wonderful contribution to this project. Again, in the next slide, I have summarized also very quickly some of the activities, the main activities I will say that we have carried out in the different locations of this project. So as you can see, they were distributed between the 9 countries, especially for what concerns the ethnographic research and the workshops with the stakeholders, and in the city of Venice, at Foscari, where we carried out mostly the academic activities and the analysis and the work on the publications. Although also some of the country experts have also worked on their publications in their locations, I should say. And so in the next slide, I wanted to just give you a hint, a glimpse, let's say, of the different phases of our project, the kind of activities we did, the type of material, archival from interviews, etc., that we have gathered during this time. What I would like to spend a couple of words on the core of the data that we have analyzed and will be the basis for my presentation today. It is actually mainly in-depth interviews that have been done with key informants and were conducted by the 9 country experts in the 9 different locations between April 2017 and March 2018. So actually, even if the project was a 4-year project, which was extended due to COVID, but let's say that the fieldwork activities was just one very intense, probably, but 1 year. And during this time, the country experts were able to gather 188 interviews in total. We have done a pilot with 3 interviews for each country, and then we have divided the key informants in 3 categories: academics, activists or policymakers, and legal experts. And each category had a somehow different questionnaire from the others. Of course, the interpretation of these interviews has been supported by other type of documentation, of course, policy documents, but very much also text or gray material produced by domestic workers, organizations, or other stakeholders. We also have important notes, observations from the country expert, and also ourselves, the core team based in Venice, has gone in these 9 countries to take part in the stakeholder workshops and do some observation and also some interviews in some cases. And of course, so therefore we have our own notes on the people and the interactions on the ground. Let me go on. Here again, a quick summary of the kind of output that we have produced. As you can see, we attempted to reach a combination of academic and non-academic production for reach out both type of audiences. For the rest of my presentation today, I will actually focus on the last item, the one before the last item in the list, so the book that I wrote myself with Daniela Cherubini and Giulia Garofalo-Geminot, which we just submitted, and we should come out in September at Bristol University Press. So here you have the cover of what is going to be our book. And in this book, what we try to do is to try to identify 3 central dimensions on the basis of our data seems to be important when speaking about domestic workers' movements in a comparative perspective. So these 3 issues, these 3 dimensions of analysis are for us the relationship between global rights and local struggles, the domestic workers' movement seen from an intersectional perspective, and finally the role of feminist and women's rights activism in domestic worker struggles. So now I will focus on each of these aspects with some examples and hopefully triggering some discussions later on. So the first issue. This issue questions the apparent incommensurability between the so-called global rights and the local practices which are associated with them. We have looked at the way C189 process was practically reflected in each country's struggle between 2008 and 2018 in relation to the wider socioeconomic, political, and cultural elements which are specific of each national context. In so doing, we have considered C189 what is called an external shock in social movement studies to the field of domestic workers' rights, and which had a different impact depending on contextual factors. On this basis, we have divided our 9 countries in 4 types, depending on the type of impact that they received, that they had, that C189 had in that context. Somewhere was stronger, somewhere was less strong or less changing. You will see that. For example, let's start from Ecuador and the Philippines. In Ecuador and the Philippines, we found a strong synergy between the ILO, the national governments, and the civil society. The Ecuadorian and the Filipino governments. I should remind you that we are talking about these countries before 2018. So the political situation in the country might have actually has changed in most of the countries I will mention. So you have to follow me on a sort of time travel somehow back. So we finished the interviews in February 2018. So we're talking actually 2017 is the year in that most interviewees have spoken about. So the years before 2017. So let's continue with the story. The Ecuadorian and Filipino governments were quick to ratify C189 and change their legislations in order to meet the requirements. They also promoted new or old, depending, organizations of domestic workers. In general, we can say that in Ecuador and the Philippines, C189 campaign has encountered a suitable cultural and political environment at the local level. And as a result, the campaign has somehow gone beyond the narrow institutional setting to influence and find resonance also in the rest of society. Yet, this is different from what we have found for the second group, which is Colombia and Brazil. Here also we have found a strong participation on the C189 process by civil society, by the state, and by other institutions all together. So again, a synergy. Yet the C189 process seems to have been embedded in a wider process of social and political transformation, which has involved domestic workers, but they were not the only subject. At the same time, it's also true that the demands from the domestic workers groups went beyond C189 as such. They advocated a more radical, what seems to us a more radical change in their conditions at the legislative, social, economic, cultural level. In these two countries, in Colombia and Brazil, we find that it's important to consider domestic workers' organizations as having a long history, which has been influenced by the incorporation, and this long history has influenced the incorporation of C189 in their local dynamics, aiming to reduce inequalities and improve the conditions of society as a whole. So, as you remember, in these countries, in the years before 2018, we had most of the interviewees are speaking, for example, for Brazil, about the Lula Dilma governments, of course, and in Colombia, the period of transition towards the peace process, etc. So this is what we have in mind. As for Ecuador, I didn't specify. For example, we had the Correa government. Probably people who are familiar with this context, they know what I'm talking about. Let's move to Taiwan, India, and Spain, where we found again a great involvement of domestic workers' organizations by civil society, international organizations, but there was a lack of support by the side of the governments. Domestic workers' rights in these three countries are opposed, in our view, by employers, of course, by conservative parties in the parliament, by brokers and market intermediaries. We have spoken so much about them in these days, that profit actually from the status quo, from maintaining the current situation. Another important element in Taiwan, India, and Spain is that domestic workers, as such as a category, are perceived as a minority subject. There could be low-caste people in India, more generally migrants and undocumented people in Taiwan and Spain. Therefore, we can say that the interests of this specific group, for different reasons, are not taken up by the entire society as a whole. In Italy and Germany, we found a sort of impasse on the accomplishment of C189 process. Italy and Germany have ratified C189 very soon, probably believing that the national legislation was already in line with the requirements of the convention. However, this was not totally the case, and the necessary legislative adjustments have not been undertaken. Yet the inadequacy is not followed by stronger mobilization. We don't have many domestic workers' organizations, and the problem is generally perceived in Italy and Germany as a problem for migrants. It's not a concern of the majority of the population, different from what happens in the first two groups that I've listed, where domestic workers are seen as a part of the society. Yet, yes, working class, yes, Black women, etc., but are considered part of the society in a socially progressive, politically progressive perspective. So in this slide, we have emphasized that the impact of C189 seems to have been greater in countries where improving the conditions of domestic workers was seen as emblematic of larger social justice struggles, which during the time of our research have involved the countries as a whole. Against that, we found that in countries where domestic work were easily associated with others, especially from foreign countries, the campaign remained isolated, issue-specific, and it was difficult for activists to build a larger consensus beyond direct stakeholders on domestic workers' issues. Let me continue. Let me check the time as well. In this book, we try to say that domestic worker struggles are intersectional struggles, and at the same time, we try to complicate our understanding on what this might mean. To do that, we found it useful to separate the different elements of groups' intersectional politics, such as the process of identity, the demands that they put through, the activities that they carry out. In our view, this may help to avoid the trap of assuming that there should be a coherence between intersectionality, so to say, at all levels or dimensions of the analysis. So in other words, we know that domestic workers activists attribute different meanings to categories such as gender, class, race, caste, etc., depending on the context. So this is depending on the context, depending on the difference between the group, the domestic worker organization or group that we are analyzing, but also within the same organization, it can be different in relation to different aspects of their activities, or it can change over time. Another side of this story is that domestic workers are generally reluctant to engage on single issue mobilization. They are reluctant to engage with approaches that tend to subsume their struggles under a universal women, of migrants, or working class or racialized people. On the contrary, they seem to try to put an effort to define a new intersectional identity as organized domestic workers. In the book, we discuss that with examples from Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador. For example, let me add for Brazil, if we think about the efforts that they put in building a new identity, a unique, specific identity for their category, but they do it intersectionally, so to say. So, for example, in Brazil, we see that domestic workers activists were able to develop this new identity as organized domestic workers, mobilizing several rhetorical devices which come from the time which come from the legacy of slavery, of course, and also from the legacy of the past struggles for the rights of women and Black people. In Colombia, local groups were equally able to produce a new identity as organized domestic workers, building on the discursive repertoire with reference to the past experience of enslaved people again, but also to the case of internal refugees and victims, women especially, of the armed conflict in Colombia. Something similar has happened in Ecuador, where, however, modern race issues we find important for domestic workers activists to emphasize class-based discriminations, in which then gender and other categories of oppression converge. I want to mention also that domestic workers groups in these countries are showing different ways to target an intersectional membership, so for the members in their activities. For example, so they put intersectionality in action, so to say, not only at the level of representation or the image of the group, but also in the everyday or in the long-term activity that they put in place. In fact, these groups seem to transcend the monodimensional or single-issue struggles for labor rights to include broader issues related to women's experiences, to self-esteem and identity, including issues of migration, anti-racism, in other contexts, access to education, training on political participation, on economic autonomy and empowerment, health, sexuality, personal and family well-being. Let me go to the last point, which is on the role of feminism. So the topic of the relationship between domestic workers groups and feminism has been important to us. Is actually, if I may add, is one of the elements which we did not foresee from the beginning of our research. It was not in the proposal, so to say, but was a recurrent topic that we found in all the national context. We could actually generalize very much the fact that the relationship, so to say, between feminism and domestic workers groups or feminist groups, no, let's say as with feminism in general, was not an easy relationship, and it came up in every country as a matter of negotiation. In some cases, we even have adjust I said before, we had 3 types of questionnaires, but in some cases we have adjusted them when we had a feminist, so to say, expert or academic or activist speaking with us. I have not said before that the core team, especially me, Giulia and Daniela, were really working closely with the country experts, in some cases discussing before and after every interview, deciding the people to interview, and so following very closely the developments of the fieldwork activity. For that reason, at one point we decided even to prepare a specific questionnaire for feminist activists and feminist voices, so to say, in order to dig deeper. Let me also add on this topic that probably one of the most of the strongest contributions on this specific aspect actually comes from the Italian case. But this does not refer to the years 2008-2018. For the case of Italy, we had to change our methodology, and we focused, Beatrice Busi, our country expert, has focused mostly on the years 50s, 60s, and 70s. These were the years in which we have found that the domestic workers movement have been more active in Italy. So I mentioned before that in Italy it was a bit sleepy in recent times, but it was instead very active in the past. And also the feminist movement in Italy was very active in those years, 60s and 70s. So we built a sort of ex-post dialogue between these two groups. We organized a workshop on that, and Beatrice Busi has edited a very nice volume called Separate in Casa, that for those that speak Italian, they will know that it's like separated couples. They keep living together in the same house, and is indeed on the relationship between feminism, trade unions, and domestic workers. So for those of you that read Italian, that's maybe interesting. So let me continue with the slide. So we found that the relationship between domestic workers group and feminists was in general a matter of troubles and somehow negotiation, even internal, personally speaking, for many of the people we spoke with. We found that in general, feminist organizations were perceived as by domestic workers as distant, although not in opposition to their cause. At the same time, it's also true that several feminists promoted domestic workers' rights on the individual basis. So the singular individual person identifying as a feminist, as maybe being a lawyer, NGO activist, or a politician, she has put forward the question of domestic workers' rights in her field, let's say. So, in spite of this marginal involvement at the practical level, we could say we as authors of the book, we believe that at the level of discourse, instead, feminist argumentations are very present in this field. And domestic workers activists have incorporated the classic repertoire of feminist critiques into their own narratives. The first of these narrative has to do with the feminist notion of valorization of reproductive labor, of course. We see indeed that in all the countries when domestic workers say to seek recognition of domestic workers' work, they are not simply demanding new contracts for their categories, they are not simply demanding better salaries or labor protection for themselves. They, especially in the Latin American context, I should say, they are also challenging the general devaluation of caregiving and reproductive work more in general, so which counts for all women, for all feminized reproductive labor. At the same time, they expand this argument, which was originally referred to unpaid labor, to include the case of paid workers who are simultaneously discriminated as women, as lower class, as from ethnic or racialized and caste minority. So they do what we call a sort of intersectional move in including other categories of people beyond women, strictly speaking, because of the social positioning as a paid domestic workers, which intersect with other layers of oppression. Another feminist frame that we can call feminist frame used by domestic workers is, of course, the one about the commodification of care, and especially all the feminist critiques on welfare and the care crisis. This was especially so in Italy, Spain, Germany, Taiwan, where activists, in this case we are talking about domestic workers activists, but also activists, let's say trade unionists also, who are working for domestic workers' rights. And in this country, like, as I said, Italy, Spain, Germany, and Taiwan, the whole debate on domestic workers' rights is very much affected by questions of citizenship and migration. For what I've said before, that are mostly international migrants. In other words, when these key informants talk about this argument, they are expanding again the feminist argument on care and welfare issues by moving the attention to the experience of migrants in the system of what Ito Peng has called global care supply and the inequalities it carries along. In conclusion, we found that the different applications of these two frames, we will say, in applying that, domestic workers activists have transformed them and enriched these arguments by adding an intersectional dimension. In other words, they enlarge the capacity of this perspective to also include racialized, low-class, migrant, and other minority groups in ways that feminist groups themselves have rarely achieved. So, by way of conclusion, what do we do beyond the domestic workers? I mean, what does this teach us? Why it could be important at the methodological level more widely? Or I would also say, if we want to go back to domestic workers and maybe go deeper on some issues, might be surprising, but 4 years are not enough, and it would be really interesting to continue with this research in some ways. But still, let's say that if we can, the takeaways for us could be that looking beyond domestic worker struggles. So what we have done in our work in the end, especially when we spoke about intersectionality, is that in line with previous feminist scholarship on intersectionality, we have argued against the tendency to think of social struggles through a categorical perspective. So separating, for example, women's movement from movement based on class and anti-racism, etc. And in this sense, domestic workers represent a group whose experiences of discrimination and their path towards the recognition will be difficult to describe on the basis of this category alone, taken as a separate. In other words, it is easy to see how the experience of oppression domestic workers being multidimensional, so also the struggle that they carry on will be a multidimensional struggle, and in the end, also the analysis that we have tried to do has been forcefully a multidimensional analysis. I hope this is it. Thank you very much for your attention.